Corydon by André Gide. Second dialogue. The following day, at about the same time, I returned to Corydon's apartment. I nearly decided not to come back, I said on entering. I knew you would say that, he answered as he invited me to sit down, but that nevertheless you would come back. That was shrewd of you, but if you don't mind, today I have come to listen to a naturalist, and not a psychologist. Don't worry. I am prepared to speak about natural history. My notes are arranged, and if I chose to use them all, I should require at least 3 volumes. But as I told you yesterday, I am deliberately discarding all medical material, not because it holds no interest for me, but because I shall not require it till later. In my book there is no need for it. You speak as though it were already written. It is at least prepared, but there is such a quantity of material that I have divided it into 3 parts, and the first will consist of natural history, which will last us for today. May I ask what will be included in the second? If you return tomorrow, we will discuss history, literature, and the arts. And the day after tomorrow, I shall do my best to satisfy you from the point of view of sociology and morality. And after that? After that, I shall say goodbye and let others have their say. In the meantime, I want to hear what you have to say. So begin. 1. I am taking certain precautions in broaching my subject and intend to quote from Pascal and Montaigne. What light do they have to throw on it? Listen, here are 2 quotations that I want to select and emphasize. They seem to me to set the discussion on the proper footing. Let's hear the quotations. You know this one from Pascal. I am very much afraid that this so-called nature may itself be no more than an early custom, just as custom is second nature. Yes, I must have seen it. I emphasize, I am very much afraid. Why? Because I am glad he should be afraid. There must be something in it. And the Montaigne? The laws of conscience which, we say, have their origins in nature, originate in custom. I know that you are well read. One can find what one wants in a good library by thorough searching. Of course, it does not matter at all, picking a random line from Pascal, interpreting it as you please, and then having the nerve to shelter behind him. Do you imagine that there were not plenty of others to choose from? I have copied a number of his sayings which show that I have not misrepresented his ideas. Read these. He handed me a sheet of paper on which the following words were copied. Man's nature is completely natural. Omne animal. Nothing can be made natural. Nothing natural can be made to lose its nature. Or if you prefer, he handed me another sheet of paper on which I read, Undoubtedly nature is not altogether uniform. It is custom that produces this, for it constrains nature. But sometimes nature overcomes it, and confines man to his instinct, despite every custom, good or bad. Are you claiming that heterosexuality is simply a matter of custom? Not at all. But that we are judging according to custom when we maintain that only heterosexuality is natural. Pascal would be flattered if he knew the use to which you were putting him. I don't think I am distorting his ideas. The important thing to understand is that when you say unnatural, the word uncustomary would be sufficient. Once convinced of that, we can approach the question with less prejudice, I hope. Your question is double-edged, and I can turn it against you. Homosexual habits imported into Europe from Asia or Africa, and into France from Germany, England, or Italy, have occasionally, here and there, been able to contaminate us. But thank God, the natural, healthy instincts of good old France have always prevailed, fundamentally decent, as one would expect. Corydon rose and paced the room for a few moments in silence. Then he continued, I must beg you, my dear friend, not to drag questions of nationalism into the discussion. In Africa, where I have traveled, the Europeans are convinced that this practice is the accepted thing. Acting on this assumption, and encouraged by the beauty of the people, they indulge it more freely than they would do it in their own country, with the result that the Mussulman, for their part, are convinced that these habits come from Europe. Anyway, I believe that example and influence play some part, that the laws of imitation, but surely you realize that they operate just as well in the opposite direction. Do you remember de la Rochefoucauld's profound words, there are people who would never have loved if they had not heard others speak of love? Think how everything in our society and our customs directs one sex towards the other. Everything teaches heterosexuality. Everything evokes and encourages it. Books, theaters, magazines, the example set by older people, The whole parade of drawing-room and gutter. If one does not fall in love as a result of all this, one has been badly brought up, the younger Dumas humorously remarked in the preface to The Question of Money. Yet if the adolescent finally succumbs to this powerful conspiracy, then you are not willing to admit that any influence guided his choice or that pressure molded his desires into the approved form. But if, on the other hand, in spite of all this advice, encouragement, and provocation, he displays a tendency towards homosexuality, then immediately you lay the blame on reading or some other influence, and you argue in the same way for an entire nation. You assert that it is an acquired taste. He must surely have been taught it. You refuse to admit that he can have discovered it for himself. I do not admit that he could have discovered it if he were healthy, simply because I do not recognize this as a spontaneous taste, except in people who are inverted, degenerate, or sick. But really, here you have this taste, this propensity which everything tries to conceal and thwart, which is not permitted to appear in art, in books, or in life, which if it does appear, falls immediately under the axe of the law, and is exposed in the pillory of public disgrace, a butt for cheap jokes, insults, and almost universal contempt. Keep calm, keep calm. Your homosexual is a great discoverer. I do not say that he always discovers it for himself, but I do say that when he is following someone else's example, then it is because he wishes to follow it, and because that example has fostered his secret inclinations. You certainly cling to your contention that the inclination is innate. I simply state it as a fact, and perhaps you will allow me to point out that this inclination can hardly be inherited, for the specious reason that the act by which it could be transmitted is necessarily a heterosexual act. An ingenious conceit. You have to admit, however, that this instinct must be irrepressibly strong, deeply ingrained in the flesh itself, or, to use the word again, it must be profoundly natural to withstand so much abuse and utterly refuse to disappear. It resembles, don't you think, an ever-flowing spring which one assiduously tries to stem, only to find it breaking out again further on, since it is impossible to quench the source. Rage to your heart's content. Repress. Oppress. You will never suppress it. I agree that the cases reported in the press have become deplorably frequent in recent years. That is because the newspapers, as a result of certain celebrated cases, have acquired the habit of reporting on it. The apparent frequency of homosexuality depends on how openly it flourishes. The truth of the matter is that this instinct, which you call unnatural, has always existed to about the same extent in all places and at all times, like every other natural appetite. What was Pascal's phrase? All tastes are to be found in nature. No doubt nature is not so uniform. It is therefore custom which causes this by constraining nature, and sometimes nature surmounts it and keeps man within the bounds of instinct. I am beginning to understand you better, but at that rate you will have to maintain that sadism, murder, and all the lowest instincts are equally natural, and that will not have got you far. I do in fact believe that no instinct exists for which authority cannot be found in some animal habit. Cats are unable to feel any excitement unless their love-making is accompanied by biting. But we are digressing. I believe furthermore, and for reasons which are fairly easy to appreciate, that sadism more readily accompanies heterosexuality than homosexuality. Let us say, for simplicity's sake if you like, that there are social and antisocial instincts. Whether or not homosexuality is an antisocial instinct, I shall examine in the second and third parts of my book. So for the moment let me defer the question. I have, first of all, not only to establish that homosexuality is natural, but also to try and give a reasonable explanation for its existence. Perhaps these preliminary remarks will not have been altogether out of place, since I must tell you that what I am about to formulate is nothing less than a new theory of love. Damn it, is the old theory not good enough for you? Apparently not, since its result is to make homosexuality an unnatural business. We live steeped in a very old and very ordinary theory of love, which we no longer think of discussing, a theory that has penetrated deep into natural history, biasing a great deal of reasoning and distorting a great deal of observation. I'm afraid it is going to be difficult to dislodge it from your mind in a few minutes of conversation. You can always try. Which is exactly what I am prepared to do. 2. He walked across the room and leaned against the bookshelves. A great deal has been written about love, but the theorists of love are rare. In fact, since Plato and the guests at the symposium, there are none that I recognize except Schopenhauer. Monsieur de Gourmont has recently written on the subject. It amazes me that a man with so shrewd a mind was not able to debunk that last refuge of mysticism, and that his uncompromising skepticism did not recoil from the final metaphysical implications of a theory that makes love the dream of all nature, and the mating instinct the secret spring of life. Also, I am amazed that this mind, often so ingenious, was not able to reach the conclusions which I myself am about to advance. His book, The Anatomy of Love, is inspired only by a concern to reduce human love to the level of animal mating, a concern that I shall call zoomorphic, the worthy counterpart of anthropomorphism, which rediscovers the tastes and passions of man in everything. Why not produce your new theory? I shall, without more ado, in its most monstrous and paradoxical form at first. Later it can be retouched. Here it is, that love is an entirely human invention, that love does not exist in nature. You mean to say, agreeing with de Gourmont, that what we call love is, in fact, nothing but the sexual instinct more or less camouflaged? That may or may not be true, but it is certainly nothing new. No. I say that the anti-theists, by claiming to replace God by the enormous idol called the universal instinct of reproduction, are merely fooling themselves. What de Gourmont is proposing is the alphysics of love. I, for my part, claim that this famous sexual instinct, which irresistibly drives one sex towards the other, is of their own invention. This instinct does not exist. You need not hope to intimidate me by your peremptory tone. What does your denial of the sexual instinct amount to at a time when the whole theory of instinct, in its most general form, is being re-examined by Loeb, Bohn, etc.? I did not presume that you were familiar with the detailed work of these men. I have not read them all, I admit, or that I was addressing a scholar rather than someone in whom I thought I detected a certain ignorance in questions of natural history. Oh, don't bother to defend yourself. This ignorance of yours is common enough with literary men, not being able to make subtle distinctions, nor being able to claim to define in a few words the limits, always very uncertain, of the confines of the word instinct, and knowing that it pleases certain people to see in the words sexual instinct a force both categorically imperative and operating like other instincts, with the clear precision of an infallible mechanism, to which de Gourmont says obedience is ineluctable. I say with assurance, no, this instinct does not exist. I see that you are making a play on words. Really the danger lies, Bohn wisely remarked in a recent publication, not in the use of the word instinct, but in the failure to recognize the meaning behind the word, and making it serve as an explanation. I agree with him. You are actually admitting the existence of the sexual instinct, and, my God, you could hardly do otherwise, and are simply denying that it has the automatic precision which some people ascribe to it. And it naturally loses more and more precision as one rises in the animal scale, so that you would say it was most indeterminate in man. We will not discuss man today. Whether precise or not, this instinct is transmitted. It has played a role and proved itself adequate. Yes, adequate. Exactly. He stopped, and putting his head in his hands, seemed for a while to be trying to gather his thoughts. Then looking up, he continued, By these words sexual instinct one understands a collection of automatisms, or at least of tendencies which in the lower species are fairly closely knit together, but which, as one ascends the animal scale, are more and more readily and more frequently dissociated. In order to hold these tendencies together, it is often necessary to have a degree of concomitance, connivance, and complicity, as I shall explain later, and without these the unity is lost and the tendencies are allowed to disperse. This instinct is not, so to speak, homogeneous, because the sexual pleasure experienced by both sexes in the act of procreation is not, as you know, necessarily and exclusively linked with that act. Whether, in the course of evolution, sexual pleasure precedes or follows the tendency does not concern me for the moment. I will willingly admit that pleasure accompanies each act whereby the vital activity is expressed, so that in the sexual act, which simultaneously involves both great expenditure and the perpetuation of life, pleasure attains its orgasm. And there can be no doubt that this labor of creation, so costly to the individual, would not be achieved without exceptional compensation. But pleasure is not so closely connected with its purpose that it cannot easily be separated and freed. From that moment on, sexual pleasure is pursued for its own sake, without any thought of fertilization. It is not fertilization that animals seek, but simply sexual pleasure. they seek pleasure and achieve fertilization by accident. And of course, it needed nothing less than homosexual to discover a magnificent truth like that. Perhaps, in fact, it did require someone who was disturbed by the prevailing theory. You will notice that Schopenhauer and Plato both realized that they must take account of homosexuality in their theories. They could not do otherwise. Plato indeed assigned so beautiful a role to it that I can well understand your feeling alarmed. As for Schopenhauer, whose theory prevails, he only considers it as a kind of exception to his rule, an exception which he explains plausibly but inaccurately, as I shall show you later. In biology, as in physics, I have to admit that exceptions worry me. My mind balks at them. I have difficulty in understanding a natural law which, only with reservations, can have universal application, a law which permits and even necessitates loopholes, so that an outlaw like yourself can accept being placed on the index and put to shame by the human laws and conventions of his time and country, but cannot accept to live outside the bounds of nature. That is a contradiction in terms. If there are bounds, then it is because the boundary lines have been imposed too hastily. And for your own convenience, you would set these boundary lines so as to include and no longer exclude love. Perfect. May I ask, without being impertinent, whether this is entirely your own idea? Others have helped. Reading Lester Ward, for instance, started the idea, or rather helped to clarify it. Don't worry, I am going to explain, and in the end I hope to show you that my theory, so far from being subversive, actually restores to love the dignity of which de Gourmont robbed it. This is getting better and better, but I am listening. You referred to Lester Ward, an American economist-biologist, supporter of the gynecocentric theory. I will start by explaining his ideas, and it's here that we reach the heart of the matter. 3. Androcentricity, which Lester Ward treats as the opposite of gynecocentricity, is scarcely a theory at all, or if it is one, then it is more or less unconsciously so. Androcentricity is the practice, commonly adopted by naturalists, of considering the male as the representative type of each animal species, of giving it first place in descriptions of the species, and of treating the female as only secondary. Now, Lester Ward starts with the point that nature could, if necessary, dispense with the male. How kind of him! In Bergson, whom I know you admire, I have found a passage which answers your interjection. Sexual generation, he says, in his creative evolution, is perhaps superfluous for plants. The female is certainly indispensable. The male element, wrote Lester Ward, was added at a certain stage, for the sole purpose of securing a crossing of ancestral strains. The male is therefore, as it were, a mere afterthought of nature. Anyway, whether deliberate intention or afterthought, the male is there. Where does your gynecocentric want him to be relegated? I shall have to take his ideas as a whole. Listen, I think this passage will clarify the meaning of the theory. He took a sheet of paper and read, "The normal color of birds is that of the young and the female, and the color of the male is the result of his excessive variability. Females cannot thus vary. They represent the center of gravity of the biological system. They are that stubborn power of permanence of which Goethe speaks. The female not only typifies the race, but, metaphor aside, she is the race. I don't see anything very curious in that. Listen to another passage. The change, or progress as it may be called, has been wholly in the male, the female remaining unchanged. This is why it is so often said that the female represents heredity and the male variation." And Ward quotes the following sentence from W.K. Brooks. "The ovum is the material medium through which the law of heredity manifests itself, while the male element is the vehicle by which new variations are added. Excuse the style. I am not responsible for it. Carry on. I pay no attention to that, since I am interested in what he has to say." From all this, Ward claims to deduce the superiority of the female element. The idea that the female sex is naturally and really the superior sex seems incredible, he writes, and only the most liberal and enlightened people with a serious understanding of biology will be capable of grasping it. He can say what he likes, but if I do refuse to grasp it, then it is because the conception of superiority seems to me unphilosophical. It is sufficient for me to understand clearly this differentiation of roles, and I suppose you understand it as I do. Go on. In support of his thesis, Ward undertakes a kind of history of the male element, as found in the animal species during the various stages of their evolution. With your permission, we shall follow him for a moment. He portrays this element as something which is indefinite to begin with, and scarcely differentiated in the hermaphrodite condition of coelenterates, then as something distinct in the form of a tiny parasite which is carried by the female 50 or 100 times larger than itself as a simple instrument of fertilization, in the same way that certain savage women carry a phallus suspended from their necks. Never having heard of these phenomena before, I was astonished. Is this natural history serious? Ward is very far-fetched. Can one take his word for it all? He rose and went towards the bookcase. These animal species and their habits have been known for a long while. Chamisso, the author of Peter Schlemihl, was one of the first to deal with them. Here are 2 volumes of Darwin, dated 1854, which are entirely devoted to the study of cirripedes, an order of animal that for a long time was not distinguished from the mollusks. Most cirripedes are hermaphrodite, but according to Darwin, in certain species there are dwarf males, simplified to a point just sufficient for their function. Sperm-bearing, without mouths or digestive organs, 2, 3, or 4 of them are found on each female. Darwin calls them complementary males. They are equally frequent amongst certain kinds of crustaceous parasites. Look, he said, opening an enormous book on zoology. This shows you the hideous female of Chondrochanthus gibbosus, with her dwarf male attached to her. But from these works I shall only retain what is pertinent to my theory. In this book, where I expound it, I show that the male element, after starting by being completely complementary, retains in itself, and tends to retain more and more, all the surplus characteristics which are not employed for the benefit of the race and which can be modified according to the individual. These are the materials of variation. I don't follow you. You are going too fast. Lester Ward will help. Throughout the lower orders, he observes, an excess of males over females is the normal condition. Yes, but I, in turn, have to point out that in these inferior species, where the males predominate numerically, the male has no purpose other than procreation. He achieves this and expires without accomplishing anything else. Superfluity, then, consists in the number of individuals, since to fertilize one female, a single male is sufficient. Here already we find a useless surplus, and in the form of individuals, material which cannot be employed for the benefit of the species. Gratuitous extravagance. In the animal scale, as the number of males in proportion to the number of females is reduced, so this gratuitous surplus becomes concentrated. The individual, so to speak, converts it to his own use. Ward's postulate remains the same. The essential thing is that no female runs the risk of living unfertilized. Hence, constant overproduction of the male element, overproduction of males, and overproduction of seminal material. But since the female, even with a single egg, is subjugated to the purpose of the race as soon as her fertilization has been accomplished, the male remains unoccupied, well equipped with a strength which soon he will exercise. No doubt he will require this strength to protect the race and provide for the wants of the female, since the interests of the race require her to be immobile. Let me call Ward to the rescue again. Nothing is more false, he writes, than the oft-repeated statement, inspired by the androcentric worldview, that the so-called superior males devote that new-gained strength to the work of protecting and feeding the female and the young. Examples follow. Do you want them? You can lend me the book. Let's go on. Not too fast. I've not finished yet. He put the 2 volumes of Darwin back on the shelf, sat down again, and continued more calmly. The essential thing is that no female runs the risk of living unfertilized. Yes, but a single male is sufficient to fertilize one female. That is an exaggeration. A single ejaculation, a single spermatozoon is sufficient. Yet the male element is everywhere predominant. Either the males are numerically predominant insofar as the male is exhausted in procreation, or when the proportion of males is restricted, each male becomes capable of fertilizing a greater number of females. What is this strange mystery? Before studying the cause of it, I would like to show you the consequences. 4. The first and fatal result among the inferior species is that if the female, as occurs for example amongst the cirripedes, does not allow several males to live with her simultaneously, and even then she has a ridiculously inadequate proportion and only marries one of them, the inevitable result is that a considerable number of males will never experience normal sex, since coitus is denied them, a number considerably greater than those which will be able to satisfy themselves normally. Let us pass on quickly to those species where the proportion of males decreases. With them, the power of procreation increases, and the problem, instead of confronting the mass, confronts the individual. But the problem remains essentially the same, an overabundance of procreative material, more seed, infinitely more seed than fields to sow. I am afraid you are playing into the hands of the neo-Malthusians. The males will copulate several times with the same female, several males with one female. But usually the female keeps quiet immediately after fecundation. I see you are speaking of animals. With domestic animals, the solution is simple. One stallion is kept for a stable, one cock for a roost, and the remaining males are castrated. Nature, however, does not castrate. Look at the useless and unpleasant fattening which the reserve tissues form in castrated animals. Oxen and capons are good for nothing but the table. Castration makes the male into a sort of female. He will take on female characteristics, or to put it more accurately, he will retain them. But whereas in the female this reserve material is straightway employed for the race, what happens to it in the uncastrated male? Material for variation. Here, I believe, is the key to what is called sexual dimorphism, which, in almost all the so-called superior species, makes the male into a creature of show, song, art, sport, or intelligence. In Bergson I have come across a remarkable passage, he continued, as he rummaged amongst his papers, which seems to me to throw light on the subject. Here it is. He is dealing with the opposition between the two orders of phenomena which exists in living tissues. Anagenesis on the one hand, and katagenesis on the other. The role of anagenetic energies, he says, is to raise inferior energies to their proper level for the assimilation of organic substances. They construct the tissues, while on the other hand, but the definition of katagenesis is less striking. You will already have grasped the significance. The role of the female is anagenetic, that of the male katagenetic. Castration, by making a useless anagenetic force prevail in the male, shows how natural for him is a gratuitous expenditure. The surplus of elements can, however, only provide material for variation in the uncastrated male, on condition, I think, that it is not expended outside. What I am trying to say is that variation is undoubtedly related directly to the degree of sexual activity. I think we must avoid drawing any hasty conclusions. The wisest animal breeders limit the sexual activity of a stallion to once a day. By a number of unregulated copulations, the stallion would be exhausted at a very early age. It would lose its vigor, but it would certainly not lose any of its dimorphic characteristics. The catamorphic force, inhibited in the case of the castrated animal, assumes first place in the complete male. I was thinking of the tenors who, for the sake of love, compromise their top notes. The most one can say is that these dimorphic characteristics only reach their fullest development in the so-called superior species, when seminal expenditure is reduced to a minimum. Sexual abstinence, on the contrary, is of no great benefit to the female. No katagenetic force will ever find material for variation in anything she withholds from the race. Listen. Alongside my quotation from Bergson, I find a passage taken from Perrier's speech at the annual session of the 5 Academies of 1905. He says nothing very extraordinary, but read it. If, in the inferior animals, the eggs can obtain possession of these reserves with such avidity that they destroy the creature that has produced them, then one realizes that it is they which check all useless developments in the superior animals, and it is for this reason that the females so often retain permanently the outward trappings of the young, which are only transitional for the male. All this is perfectly coordinated. Anagenesis. Everything, on the other hand, seems to be contrast, contradiction, and paradox when it comes to the male sex. Nevertheless, this sex also has its characteristics. Its brilliant attire and dazzling methods of courtship are, in short, nothing but a vain display of dead parts, the sign of a senseless outlay, of an inordinate waste of the organism, the mark of a temperament which can exteriorize but which knows no economy. Katagenesis. The sumptuous coloring of butterflies is to be found in tiny scales, exquisite no doubt, but quite lifeless. The coloring of birds develops in feathers which are completely dead, etc. I cannot read you the whole speech. And did not sculpture and painting develop in the same way, on precisely those parts of Greek temples and of cathedrals which had ceased to serve any practical purpose? Yes, this is how one explains the formation, for instance, of triglyphs and metopes. One might say that only things which have ceased to have practical use can serve any aesthetic purpose. But let's not insist on this. It will only distract us. The female sex, Perrier concluded, is in some ways the sex of physiological foresight, the male sex that of extravagant but unproductive expenditure. This surely is where natural selection comes in. Did not Darwin say that all things like the song of nightingales, beautiful coloring, amazing forms were there simply to attract the female? Here I go back to Ward. You must excuse so many quotations, but the theory I am attempting to formulate is hazardous, and I must ensure certain points of support. The female is the guardian of hereditary qualities. Variation can be excessive. She requires regulation. The woman is the balancing force of nature. And elsewhere, while the voice of nature, speaking to the male in the form of an intense appetitive interest, says to him, fecundate, it gives to the female a different command and says, discriminate. To tell you the truth, I distrust this voice of nature. To remove God from creation and replace him by voices, well, that's a fine improvement. Endowing nature with eloquence appears to be a case of the old maxim that nature abhors a vacuum. This sort of scientific mysticism seems as inauspicious for science as it is for religion. But it does not matter. Taking the word voice in its most metaphorical sense, I still deny that it says to the male, fecundate, and to the female, discriminate. It simply says to both sexes, enjoy. It is the voice of the glands which demand satisfaction, the organs which crave employment, organs which have been formed in accordance with the requirements of their precise function, but which are guided by the sole need of pleasure, nothing more. Logically speaking, it is less difficult to accept the supposed choice of the female, but in most cases it is the best qualified male that wins her and that she is forced to choose, as the result of elimination. He was silent for a moment as though at a loss. Then he relit the cigarette which he had allowed to go out and continued. We have briefly examined the consequences of the overproduction of the male element, and I propose to return to it in the second part of my book, which I shall explain to you tomorrow, if you like. In the meantime, we will try and ascertain the cause of it. 5. I use the word prodigality for all expenditure which is out of proportion to the result achieved. Several pages of my book will deal, in a general way, with prodigality in nature, prodigality in forms, prodigality in numbers. Today we will deal only with the latter, the surplus number of eggs to begin with, then the superabundance of seminal material. The large white doris, a sort of sea slug, lays approximately 600,000 eggs according to Darwin's most moderate computation. Yet this doris was not very common, he wrote, although I was often searching under the stones, I saw only 7 individuals. This prodigality in the number of eggs does not in any way imply a wide diffusion of the species, in favor of which it is exercised. On the contrary, it often seems to imply a difficulty in succeeding proportionate to the prodigality expended. Darwin then added that no fallacy is more common with naturalists than that the numbers of an individual species depend on its power of propagation. It is fair to suppose that with some 100 fewer eggs, the doris species would become extinct. Elsewhere, Darwin speaks of the way in which conifers have clouds of pollen carried to them by the wind, and of how they are smothered with these thick clouds of pollen, simply in order that a few grains can fall by chance on the ovules. If one were to attribute to the pollen grain some instinct whereby it was guided to the ovule, then there would be no explanation, no excuse for such profusion. But perhaps, with a smaller proportion of the male element, the mysterious act of fertilization would remain too much a matter of chance. Is not the explanation, the raison d'etre, of this almost constant superabundance of the male element to be found in a certain indecision of the sexual instinct, if I dare couple the words indecision and instinct? Will it not soon have to be admitted that the imperative quality of this instinct is really rather ambiguous? And is not nature comparable to a marksman who, knowing his lack of skill and fearing to miss the target, compensates for the inaccuracy of his aim by the number of shots he fires? I did not think you were a finalist. In point of fact, the wherefore concerns me less than the how, but it is often fairly hard to disentangle the two questions. Nature constitutes a network without beginning or end, and one is uncertain in which direction one should tackle this unbroken chain. Nothing is more problematical than the question as to whether the raison d'etre of each link is to be found in the link which precedes or the link which succeeds it, if indeed it has a raison d'etre at all, and whether the entire book of nature, to be properly understood, should not be read from back to front.
In other words, whether the last page is not the explanation of the opening, the last link the secret motive of the first. The finalist is the man who reads the book from back to front. Oh, for heaven's sake, no metaphysics. Do you want the preceding link explanation? Would you be satisfied if some biologist came along and told us that the overproduction of males is caused by insufficiency of nourishment, after previously proving, for example, that an overabundance of food tends to produce a greater proportion of females? I do not know if this is a duly established fact. But that such an overabundance of food is never realized in the natural state of affairs, or at any rate never for long. Well, suppose that this overabundance did exist and led, in accordance with this theory, to an overproduction of females. Then, either a certain number of these females would run the risk of living unfertilized, which is contrary to Ward's first postulate, or they would all be fertilized, in which case the overproduction of individuals in the following generation would result in a shortage of food, which in its turn would result in a greater proportion of males, so that in 2 generations the equilibrium would be restored. For in principle one can assume, providing no decimating factor interrupts, that there is never too much food and there is always the maximum number of mouths to be fed from nature's store. How does this explanation please you? Well, anyway, let's try the succeeding link explanation. All right, we will tackle the chain from the other end. If I maintain that the sexual instinct is inadequate, yes, insufficiently precise to assure the perpetuation of the species, then the surplus of males can be considered as a necessary precaution. Or rather, let us say that any species in which the number of males remains insufficient becomes extinct. If you like, after moving from opposite directions, the finalist and the evolutionist arrive at the same point. The excess of males is necessary for the perpetuation of the race because the sexual instinct is inadequate. That is the point which still has to be established. In a moment we are going to prove its inadequacy in nature. But first of all, I would like to examine with you the possible causes of this flagrant insufficiency. Let us proceed step by step. I am with you. You said, with a smaller proportion of the male element, the act of fecundation might have remained too much a matter of chance. It is certainly a hazardous business. You have 2 elements, male and female, which have to be joined together with no inducement other than sexual pleasure. But the joining of the 2 sexes is not an indispensable condition for obtaining this pleasure. No doubt the male is necessary for the fertilization of the female, but the female is not indispensable for the satisfaction of the male. This famous sexual instinct may well dictate to the animal the automatism whereby sexual pleasure can be obtained, but its directive is so indecisive that, in order at the same time to ensure procreation, nature must on occasions have recourse to ruses as subtle as in the case of the fortuitous fertilization of orchids. Again, you are speaking as a finalist. You must excuse me. Creation is there. Whether it could possibly not be there, I do not know, but it is. The only thing to do is to explain it as economically as possible. We are faced with races of creatures that are perpetuated by reproduction, and that can only reproduce by fecundation. It is, I say, a difficult business, a reckless gamble, and the chances of failure are so tremendous that this surplus of males was undoubtedly necessary to offset the number of fiascos. You see, nature's intention reappearing. My metaphor has misled you. Perhaps there is a God, but there is certainly no intention in nature. I mean that if there is any such intention, then it can be none other than that of God. There is no intention in sexual pleasure, which is the sole motive for that act whereby procreation is possible, and whether it preceded or followed the inclination, I still say that it has freed itself, become an end in itself, and is now entirely self-sufficient. Was it not Chamfort who reduced love to the contact of 2 epidermis, and to the exchange of 2 fantasies? Let's leave fantasy for human beings. For animals there is nothing but the sensual pleasure of contact. Are you going so far as to say that the sexual instinct reduces itself to that? No, but that without the assistance of special expedients, which I shall describe to you in a moment, it is not certain, as you have intermittently tried to maintain, it is not always assured that the male will choose the female and achieve fecundation. That, I tell you, is an arduous business, and nature will not achieve it without the intervention of favorable factors. 6. This theory was too new for my taste, and for a while I was reduced to silence. But I quickly recovered. Good heavens! Corydon, you are joking. No sexual instinct. I am no great natural history scholar, it is true, and I realize that I am not particularly observant, but down in the country, where I spend the autumn hunting, I have seen the dogs come from the neighboring village more than a kilometer away and spend the entire night around my fence, barking at my bitch. That must disturb your sleep. Fortunately, it only lasts a short while. Is that so? Why? My bitch, thank God, does not remain in heat for long. I immediately regretted my remark, for, on catching it, Corydon assumed a bantering tone which made me uneasy. But I had already gone too far not to answer, when he continued, "And this lasts about a week, and occurs twice, perhaps 3 times a year. And at other times? Corydon, I am getting impatient. What are you trying to make me say?" "That at other times the dogs leave the bitch alone. You know that as well as I do. Except at set periods it is impossible to cover a bitch with a dog, and incidentally it is not always so easy even at the right times. First of all, because the bitch refuses, and secondly, because the male shows absolutely no desire." "Ah, exactly. Is it not precisely the sexual instinct which warns them that at these times there could be no fertilization? What well-educated animals! And no doubt it is out of virtue that your enlightened dog abstains at ordinary times. There are numbers of animals that only make love in times of rut. What you mean is that females only make love, because if, poetically speaking, there is a season of love, then it is not, properly speaking, a season for the males. In particular, dogs, which we are considering at the moment, and in general, all domestic animals, have little regard for seasons. For the male, all seasons are good. For the female, only special periods. And it is only then that the male desires her. Would not this attraction be due to the odor which the female gives off at those periods? Would it not be the smell, rather than the bitch herself, which causes the dogs of the neighboring village to come flocking to the subtle odor, and which keeps them awake although they cannot reach her? It is a combination of the two, as the smell could not exist without the bitch. But if, after establishing that the bitch without this smell does not excite the dog, we go on to establish that this smell will excite the dog independently of the bitch, will we not then have made that kind of experimentum crucis of which Bacon would approve? What ridiculous experiment are you now suggesting? Well, the one that Rabelais so obscenely, or rather so accurately relates in the second book of Pantagruel, chapter 22. There we read how Pantagruel, to avenge himself for a certain lady's unkindness, secured a bitch in heat, cut her up, tore out the ovaries, and having thoroughly crushed them, made a kind of ointment to spread on the cruel woman's dress. Here I will let Rabelais describe it in his own words. Rising, Corydon proceeded to fetch the book from his shelves, and read the following passage. Redacted. Should that be treated as anything more than a fantasy? Which in itself would not be enough to convince us, he continued, but nature is constantly providing us with equally conclusive examples. This smell is so strong and disturbing to animal senses that it exceeds the role assigned to it by sexuality, if I dare use such an expression, and like a simple aphrodisiac intoxicates not only the male, but also other females that come close to a female in rut, and even makes them attempt clumsy approaches. Farmers separate a cow in season from the rest of the herd when it is being molested by other cows. And this finally is the point I wish to make, that if the sexual appetite of the male is aroused by the periodic odor of the female, then that is not the only time at which it is aroused. It has been maintained, and with reason, I presume, that the male can actually excite other males by carrying on him the smell of a recent coitus, and therefore the evocative associations of a female. It would certainly be strange if this smell, which disappears so quickly from the female, in fact, according to Samson, immediately after fecundation, should persist when transferred to another. But be that as it may, I can assure you that I have seen dogs assiduously pursue other dogs which have never had coitus, and they resume the pursuit at each fresh encounter without any regard for season. If the facts you give are accurate, and I agree to accept them as such, you can hardly do otherwise, how do you explain the fact that no account has been taken of them in the record of scientific facts? First of all, because no such record exists. Also because to date there has been very little observation of the things I am telling you, and finally because it is as difficult and rare to observe well as to think or write well. In order to become a great scholar, it is sufficient to be a good observer. The great man of science is just as rare as other men of genius. There are numerous half-scholars who will accept a traditional theory to guide or misguide them, and which they will use as the basis of all their observations. For a long time, everything confirmed nature's abhorrence of a vacuum. Yes, all the observations. For a long time, everything confirmed the existence of two different electricities, with a sort of almost sexual instinct attracting them. At present, everything once again confirms this theory of the sexual instinct, so that the stupefaction of certain breeders on discovering the homosexual habits of the animals with which they deal is really laughable. Each of these modest observers, confining his attention to his own particular species, believes these habits must be taken as monstrous exceptions. We read in Havelock Ellis that pigeons appear to be particularly prone to sexual perversion, if we are to believe M.J. Bailey, the competent breeder and excellent observer, and that Muccioli, the learned Italian, who is an authority on pigeons, states that the practices of inversion are found amongst Belgian carrier pigeons, even in the presence of many females. What? The two pigeons of La Fontaine? Don't worry, they were French pigeons. Someone else observes the same habits amongst ducks, being a breeder of ducks. Lacassagne, dealing with chickens, observes them amongst chickens. Was it not amongst young partridges that Bouvard or Pécuchet claimed to come across these habits? Yes, there is nothing funnier than these timid and tentative observations, unless it is the conclusions which some people draw from them, or the explanations they give for them. Dr. X, having proved the great frequency of intercourse between male cockchafers, then produces arguments to excuse their wickedness. Yes, it is what I was telling you a moment ago. Only the male which has just copulated and which is still impregnated with the odor of the female can offer any pretext for assault. Is Dr. X quite certain of what he says? Was it really after copulation that males in their turn were covered? Did he scrupulously observe it, or did he conveniently assume it? I suggest this experiment. I would like to know whether a dog, deprived of all sense of smell, would not in consequence be condemned to homosexuality, pure and simple, or at least to celibacy, to the complete absence of heterosexual desires. Just because the dog does not desire the bitch except when she is in good odor, it does not necessarily follow from this that his desires are dormant the rest of the time. Hence the great frequency of homosexual activity. Let me in turn ask, have you scrupulously observed it, or are you conveniently assuming it? Oh, you could easily observe it for yourself, but I know that usually people who pass and see from a distance two dogs copulating assume the sex of each from the position it occupies. Dare I tell you this story? On one of the Paris boulevards, two dogs were stuck in the pitiful fashion that sometimes occurs. They were both satisfied and were struggling to free themselves. Their efforts scandalized some people and provided great amusement for others. I approached. 3 male dogs were prowling around the group, undoubtedly attracted by the smell. One of them, bolder or more excited than the others, could hold back no longer and tried to assault the couple. I watched him for some time perform the most incredible antics in his attempt to mount one of the captives. Most of us were there, I say, to watch this scene out of more or less good motives, but I guarantee I was the only one to notice that it was the male, and only the male, that the dog wanted to mount. He deliberately ignored the female. He did all he could to achieve his purpose, and as the other dog, being attached, could scarcely resist, he had almost succeeded, when a policeman appeared on the scene and dispersed both dogs and spectators. May I suggest that the theory which you put forward, and which was no doubt prompted by your temperament, that this theory preceded the strange observations you have recounted, and that you have yourself given way to the temptation you so vehemently criticize in your scientific colleagues of observing in order to prove? One has to admit right away that it is very difficult to suppose that an observation can be the result of chance, and that it reaches the brain as the accidental answer to a question which the brain would not have formulated. The important thing is not to force the answer. Have I succeeded? I hope so, but I cannot be absolutely certain, being as fallible as others. All I ask is that the answers which nature whispers or shouts to me be verified. Finally, what I want to emphasize is this, that having investigated nature from a different standpoint, I received a different set of answers. Could not the investigation be conducted from a natural standpoint? In this particular connection, it seems to me to be difficult. For example, Saint Clair de Ville says he has observed that goats, rams, or dogs shut away from females grow agitated, and excited amongst themselves, with a sexual excitement which no longer depends on the laws of rut, and which drives them to intercourse. I beg you to notice the exquisite euphemism, which no longer depends on the laws of rut. St. Clair de Ville adds, it is sufficient to introduce a female to restore order. Is he really sure of that? Has he really observed it? He is convinced of it, which is not at all the same thing. This example is taken from a report to the Academy of Moral Sciences on the boarding school and its influence on the education of the young. Does he speak from knowledge or only as a pedagogue? And is it necessary that this female of salvation, whom he introduces into the kennel or stable where the laws of rut have been broken, should always be in heat? If she is not, then we know that the dogs will not approach her. And if we know that the dogs will not approach her, and if instead of one female 20 were introduced, they would still continue their pursuit of one another without caring about the females. Perhaps St. Clair de Ville's observations were wrong from the start. Nonsense. St. Clair de Ville's initial observations of the homosexual activities of these animals were perfectly sound. It was from then on that his flagrant inventions began. If he had agreed to push his investigations further, he could have discovered that the introduction of one or more individuals of the opposite sex was definitely not sufficient to restore order, except for about 1 week of the year when these females were able to arouse excitement, and that the rest of the time these homosexual activities continued, even in the presence of many females, as Muccioli says. No doubt you consider this lascivious sport the most innocent of pastimes. Although this play may have the greatest significance, one can say that these animals do not find, or only on very rare occasions, complete satisfaction in homosexuality. How inexorable, then, this desire must be, to drive them to it all the same. Of course you know, I said unwisely, that bitches do not always surrender willingly, even when they are in heat. The bitch I was telling you about a moment ago was a thoroughbred. I wanted her to have a litter. With great trouble I secured a male of the same breed, but when the time came to cover her, what a business! First of all, the bitch tried to escape. The dog was exhausting himself in clumsy efforts. Then, when she appeared docile, the dog completely refused. It was only at the end of 5 days that we succeeded in having her covered. "Excuse me," he said, smiling, "but are you producing this as evidence against my theory?" I could not withdraw. "I contribute my share of impartial observations," I said, "to the subject under discussion." "Thank you. Yes, all breeders know of these difficulties. On farms, numerous inseminations have to be assisted, and the sexual instinct appears in the guise of a farmhand." "Well, then, how is it done in nature?" 7. For the past hour I have been explaining to you that this is why the male element is so abundant. Your famous sexual instinct makes up for its imprecision by multiplying its incidents. On farms where one keeps an exactly adequate number of stallions, the gamble would be too great if men did not sometimes direct operations. In Sampson's course on animal technology, there are no less than 9 pages devoted solely to the serving of horses. For the stallion, he informs his students at Grignon, easily loses its way, and when it has reared, the groom has to seize the penis with his hand to guide it, etc. But, as you have said, the difficulty does not arise only from the clumsiness of the male. The female, for her part, becomes restive and tries to escape, so that it is often necessary to hold her. 2 explanations have been given for this remarkable dread. The first consists of ascribing to the animal the human sentiments of Galatea, of inflaming the desires of the male by a pretense of flight. The second consists of ascribing to Galatea the sensations of the animal, which simultaneously desires and dreads. Is it not probable that the 2 explanations coincide? I assure you that certain people do not seem to have noticed it, and once again de Gourmont proposes the second as opposed to the first. You no doubt have a third. Yes, it is that the sexual instinct is as indecisive in the female as it is in the male. The female will only feel complete when fecundated, but if as a result of a secret need of the organs she craves for fecundation, then it is vaguely sexual pleasure and not precisely the male that she desires, just as the male on his side does not desire precisely the female, and still less procreation, but simply sexual pleasure. Both of them quite plainly seek pleasure. And that is the reason why we so often see the female fleeing the male, while at the same time offering herself for pleasure, until finally she returns to the male, who alone can provide her with it. I agree that it is only with each other that they can experience complete satisfaction, at least the female only with the male, and that their organs will only find perfect employment in coitus. But it seems that they do not know it, or only in such a confused manner that ordinarily it scarcely amounts to an instinct. But for fecundation to operate, it is necessary to make these two drifting desires converge at least once. Hence, the persuasive aroma spread by the female at suitable times, whereby she indicates unmistakably her presence to the male, an aroma or some even subtler emanation to which the antennae of insects are sensitive, which, in the case of certain fish, for example, is not even spread by the female, but by the eggs, which are fertilized direct by the male, so that the female seems to be excluded from the game of love. It is through a single door, narrowly ajar for an instant, that the future must insinuate itself. For such an incredible victory over disorder and death, nature has been granted prodigality. In this there is assuredly no thoughtless expenditure, for to incur such waste is not to pay too dearly for the triumph. Waste, you said? Yes, waste from a utilitarian point of view. But it is on this waste that art, thought, and play will be able to flourish. And as we saw, the two forces, anagenetic and catagenic, set in opposition to each other, so now, in the same way, we shall see two possible forms of devotion, that of the female for the race, that of the male for his art, his sport, his song. Can you think of any drama more beautiful than this, in which two forms of devotion confront each other in sublime conflict? Are we not encroaching on tomorrow's conversation? Anyway, before leaving the subject of natural history, I would like to ask you some more questions. Do you claim that homosexual tastes are found in all animal species? In many, but perhaps not in all. I cannot say too much for lack of sufficient information. However, I very much doubt whether they are to be found in those species where coitus is most difficult, or at any rate where it is most complicated and necessitates great effort. With dragonflies, for example, or certain types of spider which practice a sort of artificial insemination, or with others where the male, either immediately after coitus or even during coitus, is devoured by the female. Here, I tell you, I make no assertions. I have to content myself with supposition. A strange supposition. Perhaps, in order to establish it as a fact, it would be sufficient to prove that in species where coitus is acrobatic or dangerous, the male element is proportionately smaller. I was rather startled by some words of Fabre. In the second half of August, I began to encounter the adult insect. Day by day, the pregnant females became more frequent. Their frail companions are, on the other hand, rather rare, and I sometimes have considerable difficulty in completing my pairs. Here he is speaking of the praying mantis, in which the male is always devoured. This scarcity of male element ceases to appear paradoxical if it is compensated for by the precision of the instinct. Since the male must be sacrificed by the female, it is essential that the desire which drives him to coitus should be compelling and precise. And once that desire has acquired precision, the excess of males becomes unnecessary. On the other hand, it is essential that the number of males increases as soon as the instinct slackens, and the instinct slackens as soon as the danger is removed from sexual pleasure, or at least when sexual pleasure becomes easy. So, the disturbing axiom that the number of males diminishes as the difficulty of coitus increases is, after all, nothing but the natural corollary of what I first advanced, that the surplus of males, or the overabundance of the male element, is compensation for the imprecision of the instinct, or if you prefer, that the imprecision of the instinct finds its justification in the overabundance of the male element. Or, again, I have understood. I insist on making my points clear. 1. As coitus is more difficult, so the instinct is proportionately more precise. 2. As the instinct is more precise, so the number of males is proportionately less. 3. Therefore, the number of males diminishes as the difficulty of coitus increases, for those males which are sacrificed, so that, if there were some other way of achieving sexual pleasure, then there is no doubt they would abandon immediately the dangers of coitus, and the species would become extinct. But undoubtedly nature has left them no other means of satisfaction. Again, I am only making suppositions. Let's consider this. As I come to understand you better, it grows increasingly clear that your conclusion appreciably exceeds your premises. I admit I am indebted to you for making me reconsider these matters, which are usually governed by a sort of authoritarian principle, imposing a ready-made set of beliefs that one carefully refrains from questioning. Here, then, is the point I reach with you. Yes, the sexual instinct does exist, in spite of what you say. It operates, although you will not have it so, with precision and extraordinary insistence. But it is only compelling at the correct time, at the moment when the two elements come into play. In order to ensure that the female's momentary demands meet with instant response, she is confronted with the permanent desire of the male. The male, you have said, is wholly gratuitous. The female is full of foresight. The only heterosexual contact of animals is for the purpose of fecundation. And the male is not always content with that. For some time we have been losing sight of your book. Have you any conclusions to draw from this first part? Just this, which I put to the finalists. If, in spite of the almost constant overabundance of the male element, nature still requires so many expedients and artificial aids to ensure the perpetuation of the race, will it surprise us to learn that just as many restraints and of just as many kinds may be required to check the propensity of the human race for those habits which you have termed abnormal, and that just as many arguments, examples, inducements, and encouragements may be needed to maintain the desired ratio of human heterosexuality? But will you grant me that there is some good in this restraint on the one side and this encouragement on the other? I will grant it until tomorrow, when we shall examine the question no longer from a zoological but from a human point of view, and we shall consider whether perhaps repression and excitation have not gone too far. But in return, will you for your part admit that homosexual habits no longer seem so unnatural as you claimed this morning? That is all I ask of you today.